Welcome to our Greenburgh Town Board meeting. Today is September 19th at almost 5:15, and we're going to be devoting the entire meeting to focusing on flood-related issues, Troublesome Brook and Manhattan Brook, and we have guests, Woodard and Curran, and they've been commissioned to do a study. Anthony Catalano, Joseph Kirby, Rich Fahn, Commissioner of Public Works, and Brian Simmons, Deputy Commissioner, will give a presentation, and then we could ask questions.
If everybody would turn on their microphones and give me back my agenda. Thank you. That's right. It's
So
like
great.
a fruitcake.
So good. So thank you very much, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about, what you've done to address, flooding. Any recommendations you have?
Sure, absolutely. My name is Anthony Catalano, Senior Vice President with Woodard and Curran. We've been working together with the town of Greenburgh for many years. We appreciate the opportunity to support your community. We have with us this evening, in addition to myself, our flood mitigation expert and leads our flood mitigation practice nationally for our organization, including a number of projects that we're doing throughout Westchester County for New Rochelle and Harrison and White Plains and so on. So Joe Kirby, as I said, leads our work in that regard. He worked for FEMA for many years and has some real unique insight. And I also want to just add that, being able to do these types of studies in a successful way has a lot to do with coordinating with the client, in this case directly with DPW and your engineering department, specifically Rich and Brian, and their partnership has been very helpful in getting through the process here. So we're pleased to be able to go through what we've done at this point. There's still certainly work to be done, some heavy lifting that needs to be done here, but this also is an opportunity for you all to ask questions. I mean, we have the right people at the table here, and please feel free to ask whatever questions you may have. And I say us, but even more so, Joe would be happy to address them. So with that, I'll pass it over to Joe.
All right, thank you, Anthony.
Joe, if you could just move the mic closer to you.
Hold this in. All right, so I am going to share my screen here and pull up a presentation. I talk a little bit better with pictures in front of me. It's a little easier to explain, and if I don't know if I can get that off the screen, minimized. Put it up there. Yeah, it's still, but that's fine. All right. So thank you for the opportunity tonight. As Anthony noted, I've done a lot of work with FEMA over the years and have done probably in the last 20 years many flood mitigation projects and a lot of projects. Never have I worked on a stream called Troublesome Brook, but I assume that was just Anthony trying to give me a challenge. So we'll work on that. Basically, the two studies that we've been asked to work on and we've been working on for the duration of this project are Troublesome Brook and Manhattan Park Brook, and they're both 2 to 3 square miles with a couple of miles of streams. So in Manhattan Park Brook, Manhattan Brook, and Troublesome Brook, the major tributaries in these studies. They're heavily developed, both of them, especially Troublesome, as you go further down in the watersheds. The picture on the right here shows both these watersheds in Greenburgh, and they were brought to us that they both had major issues with flooding, some maintenance issues, but also just many issues that the systems are old, and they were built many years ago, and they were built to different standards than we'd like to have them built to today. So there's been a lot of investigation done, and we'll do an analysis to figure out the best way to mitigate and alleviate as much as possible. Obviously, we can't eliminate it, but as much as possible, any of the flooding that's happening into the two studies. The other note here is Troublesome does empty out directly into Yonkers, and especially when we went into the county meetings when we were looking for funding, that was always a question. Are you just going to build a big pipe and send the water to us? And the answer is no. I mean, we can't do that. One of the guidelines is to do no harm. We have to make sure that whatever we do, it'll reduce flooding here, but also not create flooding somewhere else. It's a lot of how we do our work.
When did this study commence? About 2 years ago?
I would say less than, at some point last year, I mean, I'd have to
Bring the
look back
microphone
when.
closer to you.
Oh, I'm sorry. At some point last year, Supervisor, I'd have to go back to look exactly when we started.
And I believe we got funding from the county to help the town pay for this, right?
It was approved, so it went through the,
Turn it on.
sorry, Francis, he told us.
So give him that.
Thank you. So we went through the Westchester County Stormwater, Stormwater Advisory Board. That was approved last year. So now I believe it's with the legislator at the county level.
We have information. And we have, Supervisor, we have information on one of the slides related to the funding and what was approved through that committee. So we can go through that when
Okay.
we get to it.
Yeah. So, and we don't need to discuss all these in detail, but these are the tasks of our project. They're also in line with the county program, and these tasks are all required to receive funding through the county. So we developed our project that way. Some of the probably unique pieces in this is to actually do a cost-benefit analysis. That's something required. It is something that we would typically do once you've decided on a project and are moving it forward and looking for funding. We definitely do a cost-benefit analysis, but it might also be something that's not typically looked at this stage in the process, except for like the county rules and what they're looking for. So we have done 3 tasks so far. We've gone out and done data collection. We've sent our engineers and staff out into the field to collect information on structures and to collect information on the hydraulic characteristics of the stream and different problem areas, and took tons and tons of photos and lots of notes. And then we've also developed our baseline, and that's where we are currently. We'll go through those 3 tasks in a little bit more detail.
So your data, is that historical data or is that empirical data? Did you actually go out and measure?
No, we actually went out and observed. We didn't do any survey. There is a scope to do that, to hire a surveyor and go out and do that. And one of the reasons we asked the surveyors to go out and do it is because that's the most accurate way to do it, and they can do it the quickest. We can't touch their rates and how fast they can put it together, but they put it together in a format that we can directly import it into our model. And that's one of the reasons we'll talk in a minute about. We did get data, part of our data review. We did get CAD files and a little bit of GIS data, but then a lot of record files. And those record files, sometimes those are questionable because they're older than any maintenance you've done.
That's my point.
And so we're actually want to go out in the field and collect that. In some areas that are less critical, like way up in the basin at the community college, once we get started again, we'll ask them again, see if we can get some drawings from them. And that we wouldn't mind using record drawings for them because there's not really a concern that we're trying to address up there, so we can use less accuracy in that region of the study. Let me go to the next one. I think I can show you a couple of, so this is kind of the examples where we're going out and in the field. March of 2022, we go through and we look at all the channels, we verify the conditions. One of the biggest factors in our modeling is what's the frictional factors. So we visualize the stream and we can determine that through different methods. So we're collecting attributes that we're going to put into our models. It's not necessarily the actual survey size or shape of it, But it is that there's a structure there. A lot of times, that's one of the things that our crews are doing, is identifying everything. So we know wherever the structures are, and we know what has to be surveyed, and what is just, might be a pipe just coming in from a small development or something, we don't need to survey. It's not critical. So we send our out to do that. The other thing we did is we went, let me just go back one. We went down into Yonkers, and I apologize, is it Crescent Pond? Crestwood? Lake. That is going to be our endpoint for Troublesome, because that's where we're going to measure if we do harm, basically. We're going to look at the whole study, we're going to study it all the way down there, and we're going to look at if we change either the flow going into it or the elevations of that lake as one of our conditions of whether we're changing things, whether we're making more or less flood for Yonkers while we do the work here for you.
I just have a quick question before
Yep.
we move on. So you said, are you saying, is the brook called Crestwood, or are you talking about the actual village of Crestwood, or Crestwood?
Well, Crestwood Lake.
Okay. I
Yeah,
just wanted to
Crestwood
see
Lake
when you
is
say it's going down
is
the
kind of
lake.
our endpoint for that one.
Okay.
Manhattan Brook, it's Bronx River, so
Yep.
we'll look at the Bronx River. And in Yonkers, so we did actually go, and our crews did do some quick measurements of all the structures in Yonkers, because we don't need that detail. We just need enough to understand how things are conveyed, and that we're not causing things to change when we do things up here.
You know, what is the situation now with Crestwood Lake? Like, does it rise and flood now, or is it low and it can accommodate the flow, or is that what you're going to determine?
Well, that's
through
what we'll
these?
determine with
Okay.
the study, and we are, we can talk. We have started doing some of our initial modeling. So we've built the initial model, but we do need the survey to put into it so that we can have accurate results and we can actually make statements about the flooding.
Sticking with Crestwood Lake, are you noting obstructions and so forth that they can take care of? Because, if they remove obstructions, it'll give you a better way to determine that, no?
Well, if we were actually doing work in Yonkers and looking at that in detail, then it would be critical. But for us today, it's just a endpoint, and we'll get a condition in our initial model. So it'll tell us what the elevation is, it'll tell us what the flow is, and our goal will be whatever we do in Greenburgh, we don't change that condition in Yonkers.
Well, but if there are obstructions and in future, they remove those obstructions or the culverts haven't been cleaned out. And that, well, it may or may not, because potentially it could create a flooding situation at Crestwood Lake that then Yonkers would look to Greenburgh and say, see, you did this.
Yep, so we
Right.
talked about that.
You could,
Why don't you just keep it close to you so that you don't.
We talked about that internally a bit, Ellen, and it's really a communication point, right?
Right.
So as we're going through this study, and we're communicating with Rich and Brian and others, the supervisor and others, it is important to have those conversations with the other municipality. I guess what Joe is saying is, this study does not include studying Crestwood Lake, right?
Right.
It considers, are we having any impacts? And to your point, if we're having that communication with the city, we'll understand if they do have issues with obstructions. Are there plans to remove some large trees or other obstructions that may have fallen into the lake? But again, I think that's through that communication that we have with the
Right.
municipalities, and that would occur as we're working through the model.
Yeah, and I believe, isn't Paul Summerfield on the,
He's also on that, so
On the-
he's
on the
also on the
committee.
committee.
Right,
Yeah, so
right.
that's one way, and I also have spoken to Paul separately as well.
right,
And so you make a really good point, because he didn't bring that up specifically, but he said something to the effect of, as you're going through the model, if there are questions or other issues, we can talk about that, so.
right. It's just a good neighbor
Yep.
kind of,
Crestwood Lake, I'm just trying to envision, I know where, the Bronx River, is, where is it in conjunction with the river?
Well, we can,
Do you have an aerial that shows?
yeah, this is the
Yeah, we have
lake.
that now.
It's behind, what was that store? Was it Bye Bye Baby on Central Avenue?
Yeah.
Left-hand side? Or, and then it was like Kids R Us?
Kids R Us was in that, by California Not,
Yeah.
is it
Yeah,
California?
Yeah, like,
California Kitchen?
but on the opposite side of that area,
This might,
on the Yonkers
this
side.
might show, the lake is down here.
Yeah.
Or excuse me, the river is down here at the border, and this is the lake. And so this is our basin that we've delineated from the lake. So everything that drains into the lake is inside this red line. And of course, our focus is on this side of the line, the Greenburgh side of the line. But we'll do basically very rudimentary study there. The challenge is that it's hard, without the accuracy, it's hard to say any definitive statements about Yonkers. And that, again, that's not our goal. We just want to say, we understand that based on our conservative look at it, this is the condition, right, wrong, or indifferent. This is the condition we come up with. And when we make a change upstream, we don't change that condition downstream. And so, it's really, it's more conservative look at it. So actually, in that, and when I say conservative, I mean, it's probably going to show more flooding than might actually happen, because we're assuming some minimal factors for how the water flows.
Are you saying that all the water that goes into Troublesome Brook and Manhattan Brook, Park Brook, originates in the town of Greenburgh?
No, I mean, it is within this basin, and so this is Greenburgh. This is, well, yes, all the water that you experience originates in Greenburgh, so.
The Greenburgh watershed.
I'll
So
correct it
there's
that way.
nothing upstream
Yeah.
contributing to this. So when we're being
No.
a good neighbor to the south, there's no one to the north who should be a good neighbor to us.
Right.
That's actually a good
Right.
point, right.
Because that's
correct.
not necessarily what has happened in the past, particularly with the sawmill, where Babbitt Court had no treatment whatsoever, but north of Greenburgh and south of the town of Greenburgh, there were improvements made without a concern about being a good neighbor by the Army Corps of Engineers to Babbitt Court.
And homes
Just
were
wanna put it out
homes were
there.
elevated.
Right, I just want to make sure that, all this good neighbor should be applied across the board.
Yeah. All right. Let me continue to move forward. So these are the details, and I won't go into them too deeply of what we've done. What we've basically done, the hydrology part, which is how much water shows up. And then we're doing, the next part is the hydraulics. Where does all that water go? How does it flow? Where does it move? How deep does it get? We're using a 25-year designed storm event that I believe is typically higher than what the city uses, and but it's also we get a little better feel that way. If we're using a little bit more water, we can understand what the deltas and the changes are. But we will also run the other storm events, so we can see what happens at the 2, 5, and 10-year event, also the 50, 100, 500 year.
Last week, we had a meeting in another section of Edgemont, and people were complaining about, the drains not being designed for 25-year storms, when we now get them like every other week.
Are designed for a
This-
25-year storm.
Ours are designed for
Right.
25.
And the
Not
sewer
designed
systems are
for
not
ours.
designed for
Right.
more than that.
So
That's
is one of the problems that we need to, the infrastructure, we should gradually go from 25-year drains to drains that could handle, say, a 100-year storm or more. I mean, with that,
That includes the pipes, too,
Right, that's
not
what I'm
just the.
Yeah, and it's always what you can afford. And we were dealing with another community where I got some video that all the water is running down the street about 6 inches deep, goes down to an intersection where there's a whole bunch of catch basins, and it gets sucked into the system. And they were saying, how do we fix this? And I said, well, it's working exactly the way we designed it, or someone designed it originally. Do we want to make less water so we'd have to put in more pipe? So it's always a question of cost and what condition you actually protect to. The other thing is, we do talk about what type of an event it is, but again, that's all statistics. This is based on a 24-hour storm. And what happens is when you get that event, you don't see much because it was designed for it. So everybody says, well, no one mentions it. But then when we get 2 really high-intensity, short-duration events, and everything
Like
floods,
last week.
right? Then everybody says, well, what happened? Well, what happened is we didn't design it for that.
Can I just ask another question? Because, and I, brought this up to Rich earlier today, and last week when we were in a neighborhood, again, it was a 25-year design drains, and I noticed on Hillside Avenue where we're building a sidewalk, Con Ed is digging underground, for the gas work, and then we have a contract with a contractor who's going to be doing a sidewalk and also drainage. Would it make sense, would it make sense if Con Ed would agree to, say, a partnership with communities, because they're digging practically every street in Westchester, if they would say, okay, when you dig the street, if you pay for the drain, a drain replacement effort, would that then, we could partner, and this way you won't have the extra expense of digging again. I mean, is that a way of solving, gradually?
Yeah, so
Anthony?
that's usually a timing issue, right?
But let's say,
So in an ideal scenario, it certainly makes sense. I mean, when you hear the term, or if you've heard the term at the state level, complete streets, it's all about looking at things more holistically. So it's not just, hey, we have to repave, but are there capital plans involved to replace some pipes or do some other buried infrastructure work? If there is, let's coordinate that so we don't pave and then we're there in 6 months and we're ripping everything up again. So it really comes down to, as it typically does, to timing. And if there are those kinds of thoughts, it's the coordination with the utility company on a parallel path to studies like this to understand, well, when we have the information that we need on what improvements we need to do with the infrastructure, how does that align with, let's use Con Ed as an example, how does that align with Con Ed's plans? And does it make sense? And can we work with Con Ed, and maybe they hold off on doing those streets because you'll be ready in a few months with the information you need to do that. So again, it really comes down to timing.
but that's a way, like, say, Old Edgemont, all the drains are they're antiquated, they all have to be, the infrastructure has to be replaced. So the thing is, if Con Ed's going to be doing all these streets, and they basically then would coordinate with us, we could make this a win-win, because just like we did with sidewalks, every year, we could do a certain amount of rebuilding drains that could last.
It's not a bad idea, but again, it's not just the drains, it's the pipes, and you really would have to have a holistic idea. You can't just, fix the pipes in this one area, but the pipes that feed them are outdated
No,
and
that's what I'm
broken,
saying,
too
right,
small.
yeah.
So you just have to have that broader view, but it's something to aspire to, I think.
Yeah,
What we would advise is, when you go through a study like this and you come up with recommendations, right, and ultimately there's an understanding or an agreement on what those recommendations should be, we all agree, then that is used to help inform future capital improvement plans.
Right.
So once you have this information for these specific areas now, right, so with respect to, other portions of the town, I can't speak to that, but with respect to these study areas, once you have that information and what the proposed improvements are, you use that to inform the capital plans. And those capital plans have a schedule, an implementation schedule, that you then work with a utility company, whoever, to see if you can go ahead and negotiate a deal like that. But I think you first need to understand what the proposed improvements are and have that information, excuse me, and have, I say a capital plan, a master plan, whatever you prefer, but you understand, just have a plan as to how you're going to move forward and the timing of it. What are the budget constraints to do that? And that'll dictate, what your schedule looks like.
We've diverted a little bit, but just a quick question apropos of the supervisor's query. In your experience, have you found Con Ed to be collaborative in terms of scheduling along those lines on a complete streets kind of format, in your experience?
We have, in particular around storm hardening opportunities and burying lines, but it's not inexpensive. Even in a cost-sharing scenario, it is not inexpensive, right?
Correct.
The work that they're doing combined with yours. So Certainly, I would encourage you to keep an eye on that as you continue to move forward with this study and not totally discard it, but it's a possibility, sure.
You also got to remember that we can't, so if Joe's got a problem at his house, right, with his pipes, and now we're putting bigger pipes on his street at a certain design level, we can't send the problem then down to Gina. So that's all got to be designed, and there is a process. And we do work with Con Ed. So each year we send them the lists of the roads that we're going to be paving or working on, and we have been, over the last few years, actually doing complete streets. I think Judith's area was just finished, where we come and we look at the drainage, if there's failing
Yeah,
pipes.
Hillside Avenue.
We fix it, we put the curbs in, and then we come pave it. Unlike Tomahawk and Leatherstocking, where we did it, they were informed, and then they came and blew it up anyway. So there are times when it doesn't work.
Exceptions.
Hopefully, most of the times it does.
Yeah, I would hope we could stay focused on stormwater.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because, putting in wires is easy, right? You can increase the gauge of wires in one area of town. It has no effect on anybody else. The elephant in the room is we can't just start going in and putting in pipes for a 100-year storm in some areas. If you put that upstream and those pipes are 100 years, at some point they're going to hit the 25-year, and those people are going to be seriously affected.
Right.
In a perfect world,
My point.
click your heels and make it happen. You start downstream, you put in the bigger pipes, and provided it's being a good neighbor to Yonkers, which has 25-year storm pipes as well. Everybody does. And then work your way up the line. That takes an unbelievable coordination and probably billions of dollars. And you want to look at a tax increase. So we're trying to address it by making sure, first of all, our pipes don't collapse. Secondly, improve them where we can. And thirdly, see if there's other ways of addressing the water by detention or retention so that our pipes can handle it.
And that's a great point. I mean, as part of the study here, when you start to understand what the recommendations are, there is a process where there is that prioritization, and that's what you're talking about, right? There's a prioritization of, well, what projects should be done before others, but what Joe is going to get into a little bit is the real value of building this model, right? Look at it in terms of an investment that's made up front to have this model where you then can look at many, many, many different scenarios. Hey, if we go and put in, pipes that are 100-year storm event capacity upstream in this particular neighborhood, you put that into the model. What does that do downstream? It becomes very, very, very efficient after the model is built, and Joe will get into that a little bit.
Yeah. And that's a good transition point right here. We talk a lot about, when we talk about our model, we're going to talk about 1D and 2D, one-dimensional and two-dimensional. And the one-dimensional part are all the pipes and all the ditches and all the lines that water flows and follows. And so we model those in combination with a two-dimensional model, which is the surface water model. And we do this study on a basin-wide basis. So we get an answer for all impacts to anything we change throughout the entire basin. So every time we push go, we get an answer for the entire basin of what the water surface elevation is, the maximum at any point in the basin. And when we make a change, we run it again, and we get another result that shows us that. And we'll show, I think on the next slide here, these are the initial runs that we've done on Troublesome. And what you're seeing here are depth grids. So these are depth of waters based on rainfall throughout the entire watershed all at once. So it's not very easy to read, can't quite pick out things, but we can see where the water starts pooling. We can also see, we did have a little bit of GIS data, so we dropped that in. And so we do have some pipes on the Greenburgh side, but on the Yonkers side, we don't. And as you see, there's a lot more surface water just hanging out there. And again, that goes to that accuracy. And so the huge advantage of this is that we can decide, okay, we're going to put storage over here because we have room what does that do to us? We can put that storage in, it can operate, and we can see the impacts on the entire watershed. Does that improve, does not improve? Especially in developed areas, a lot of times when we look at storage, we're looking at cumulative storage. We're finding several places to put storage in and putting it in there instead of just one huge pond or one big lake somewhere. There's no room for that. The other big thing we look at is pipes, and if, how are the pipes connected? And so what is the timing of the water flowing through? A lot of times we can reduce flood levels by changing the timing, either slowing some water down with storage or speeding some water up with a more direct, larger pipe. And so we can get that to run through the system quicker, then we can improve, we can reduce the flooding. But the big thing is we do it on a basin-wide scale so that we can look at every point. And really, these models are not new, but the technology is finally there where we can do it on a reasonable time frame. I mean, some of these models, this one here was probably 3 or 4 hours running on a pretty good computer. So they do take time to run, but they're very valuable. In another community, we've done another flood study. We put in a really big pipe. We improve the flooding there considerably. It hasn't been reduced, but it hasn't been eliminated, but it's been considerably reduced. But we've also, since then, we've done multiple projects. Sewer separation is our latest one, where they have a street, they want to do a sewer sep on it. They want to understand the flooding that comes as a result of that, because they're going to put it now in a drainage system. Well, typically, that's a whole new study. There's a design that you can't ever get rid of. That's a whole new study. Instead, we just add it to this model. It takes our engineers less than a week. You run it and you're done. You understand the impacts. And instead of becoming its own project and its own study. And that's one of the biggest reasons we've suggested this and gone with this for your study, because Troublesome Creek, it's been a challenge forever, and this is the way we're going to understand it the best.
So can I just ask a question? Because Rich and I get calls from some people like every couple hours near Troublesome Brook. So when people are saying, we just want a new pipe, just put a new pipe and it will solve the problem. From what I hear, let me see if I understand it. If we fix a pipe, one pipe, it could have impacts and create flooding in another area. So what this model is going to do is it will show us if we fix a pipe here, then what's the impact going to be to the rest of the town. So we can't really look at this as just, say, Clarendon Road or Clarendon Place. We have to say, how is it going to impact all Central Avenue or all the other, so did I basically pass that test?
It will. We can say, what happens if we add a pipe? And we can add that pipe to target that location.
But then this model is going to help you.
But then it will also help us understand everything else, all the other impacts.
And that's the difference when you're not limiting the study to one local area, right? You may be missing the boat on potential solutions in other portions of the basin, right?
Well, like last week, somebody called me, from Troublesome Brook, and they said, get over here right now and fix the pipe, because the pipe was.
Well, that may be appropriate if it's a collapsed pipe.
No,
If it's a
they said,
collapsed pipe.
or replace the pipe, not replace the pipe, I think it was. So the issue really is, you can't really do it until you have the whole general analysis.
Yeah, if it's replacement in kind, and it's the same exact size pipe and everything else, well, that's one thing. But if they're saying, no, put a bigger pipe here, well, then what does that do for?
You need to know what you're dealing with.
Yeah, exactly.
And it really is coming, there is a real big push about looking at downstream impacts. We've always, the work that I've done, we've always tried to look at downstream impacts, but it's not that easy. Especially if you're using a lesser model or a lesser analysis, you're just doing it on a spreadsheet or like when DOT does designs, they put out a spreadsheet, they're just looking to make sure it doesn't pop out of their catch basins. They're a lot of times not looking at what comes out of the pipe and what that causes. But there's a shift. I mean, we're now seeing it from the county here. There's guidance for FEMA, like if anybody gets public assistance to replace a culvert that was washed out recently, you're going to have to do a downstream analysis now, because that is being pushed today, so that people aren't flooding other people. So going back to the presentation, we do have a run for Troublesome Creek, but again, we don't have the level of detail we need to start making statements about it or start looking at flood results. And then we also have one for Manhattan Park Brook. And this one, there's no detail. And so really all I'm showing you the model, but I'm also showing you that without the pipes and without the streams, it gets a lot less valuable. And this is kind of our point, that we really need to collect some more data and get all that data put into the model so we can.
Last week, the Greenburgh Housing Authority met with the town board, and they were talking about demolishing the existing low-income housing there and creating, new housing and adding 60 units on top of the 131. And the point was raised, how is development going to impact, flooding? So would this model actually be able to help the town board and the planning board and the developer, determine whether or not, what they should do and whether or not the project is feasible?
There's a tributary, I'm not sure what it's a tributary of, that runs right behind that property.
It can. There are, and I want to remember the right term, but there are communities out there that have gone away from just telling people to put in detention and have gone with a living model. They call it that it's the town's model, and if you want to do development, you have to put your development in there and then see how everyone else is impacted. It's actually done in more of a 1D scenario typically, because it's a much simpler model, but it does work for if you're trying to require detention or not, because often it's better to not have detention so you can get the water out quick, so you're not building up flows of water. This model can definitely be used for that. It's probably maybe overkill for that. It's definitely a good model for the city to use when the city's trying to plan projects or do infrastructure.
You mean,
Sorry, I
Greenburgh.
apologize.
Just make sure you're not New York City.
Where is he going with this?
So it's definitely good for planning infrastructure. But there are easier ways to do that, but you could use it as a living model and put everything through it, and it will give you the results.
I've never heard of a 1D model.
Well, 1D just means that the water only moves on a defined path, so in one direction, back or forth.
And it doesn't take into consideration how the water gets in there?
Well, typically, most models that are like HEC-HMS or HydroCAD, you're basically defining how the water moves and where it goes. In a two-dimensional model, you're allowing the terrain to decide where the water goes. So you don't have to draw all those
Which is what this is.
flood paths, which is, what
That's real life, right? Because next to the housing project that's proposed, the water is going to come from terrain into what they're calling Watercourse Brook, because they couldn't find a name for it, so they just named it Watercourse Brook. So that's what we need to know is, would there be a significant amount of water added to that brook, which happens to be a town property? So we need to know that so that we know what the mitigation factors are. Instead of having the development built, people get flooded, and then they say, why did you let us build it? Right. So will that be part of this model?
I mean, you could use it for that, but I'm assuming you guys do pre and post, so you require the developer to determine how much water is running off today and how much will in the future, and then you're requiring them to detain it so it doesn't change what runs off in the future.
Last week, there was somebody also in Edgemont, and there's a single house that was built, and on top of the hill, he lives on the bottom of the hill, and his whole, backyard and a lot of the property in his house, got flooded, I went with the town engineer.
Yep.
There. So in the future, should, say, the planning board and, say, the town board, our engineers require, if there's if a house is being proposed, say, on a steep hill, to basically do a much more comprehensive, analysis so we could really decide whether or not there's going to be flooding impacts, because that was like a really big, he was devastated because he's.
Sometimes the issue, we may have required that, but the contractors often
No, but I'm saying,
shortcut and then that creates the problem if it wasn't built
but
to
I'm saying
spec.
no, I'm not talking about going backwards. I'm saying going forward, should the town be creating a new model for development of even single-family homes, where we're requiring a much more comprehensive flood analysis?
Well, so if I could,
follow what I'm
sorry.
saying?
So I just want to clarify. So under the current town code, chapter 248 is
Right.
our stormwater management law.
Right.
So for any new development, whether it's a proposed addition, whether it's a single-family house, commercial development, whatever that may be, they have to comply with that stormwater code. So underneath that code or that law, any new impervious area or surface, so whether it's a new driveway, a new roof, a new addition to a house, that all has to be managed on site. So there can't be any increase in runoff off the site. So that's handled on a parcel by parcel basis for private property. Really what this model is designed for is for handling the stormwater that's being captured on the public roads, right, and on the public right-of-ways. And I think it's important to note that blue area that you see there is what's considered to be the watershed area. So in other words, that's the area, based on the topography of the existing terrain, the water that's draining into these creeks or these basins and whatever, it's draining into. And so when we were talking earlier about the Greenburgh Housing Authority, shortly after Hurricane Ida, and I can attest to this because I saw it firsthand, the old Tarrytown Road Park is the one that ended up getting flooded out, and actually got flooded out twice in a matter of a 3-week span, something like that. And unfortunately, the basketball court kind of got washed away, and a lot of the park structure, all the base underneath it kind of got washed away. And so to address that question, that area is within this watershed area of the Manhattan Park Brook. So at least what this model will be able to tell us is any improvements that are made, how those improvements might impact that park area, if you will. Under that current development, they're going to have to comply with that chapter 248, that stormwater management code. That code does require that any new development comply with the 25-year storm event. That's what the town code is. Now, if the discussion has to be for a larger storm event, that's got to be part of, I think, a larger discussion with the board.
Good thought.
But that's the code as of right now, as it stands right now, is a 25-year
But
storm.
I think, maybe the land use committee, maybe we could be looking at whether 25-year, plans is inadequate, because we don't get the 25, we know we're going to get more than 25-year storms.
I guess the problem is I think maybe it was Francis who mentioned earlier, if we start putting in pipes for 100-year floods, then eventually, probably sooner rather than later, there's going to be an issue, because as we keep getting them, they're going to hit, Yonkers or wherever, and all of a sudden back into Greenburgh, because they're not going to be able to, the 100-year pipes aren't going to be, the 25-year pipes in Yonkers aren't going to be able to accommodate the 100-year pipes coming from Greenburgh.
But maybe-
So that's not really a solution, but maybe we're
But
working
that's
maybe we
okay.
could, I'm saying
Can I
maybe we
ma-
could work with, if you have the model and somebody wants to come up with even a single-family home or a larger development, then, you could give us advice on whether or not, we should require something else, or maybe we could take a look at the code, because, again, people are going to say, how come you're not, how come there's a development?
May I make a suggestion? Let's note our questions so that Woodard and Curran can finish their presentation, since we're so limited in time tonight. And then if we have time, we can ask questions, or we can ask them back, or we can write to them for.
I think we're here for the big picture.
Yeah.
as opposed to individual
Yeah.
parcels. We'll deal with the individual parcels, but that'll be based on analysis of the big
You know,
picture.
people just keep yelling at me, even complaining and saying, how come my house is getting, I'm just calling based on the reactions that I get from residents who are upset.
And again, this is a very good model. One of the challenges might be for a single home is the granularity of that single home and the unique, slope where the water's coming out and all those things. Not that this won't show you that. We can get down to almost 7 square feet is usually our smallest size of the cell we work with. But but it might be overkill for what you're trying to do. There might be better ways, more efficient ways to do that type of work. So moving through this, I think the next part, the next process that we went through was the funding request. This is the request we put into the Stormwater Advisory Board, and that was approved on May 19th of 2022. It was to fund both studies, the data acquisition, which is the survey, and then there's a 50% match. So that process we did go to the county committee, make the presentation, and that was approved. Some of the other things that we've done as kind of part of this study, we supported. We came up here and talked to Rich and the team doing the rework to Troublesome Brook, and also got the information from the CCTV that was done and all the cleaning that was done. That was some great information. We supported that work. And then I want to talk about some possible solutions, only because these are things we've been talking about over time, but we really don't have the information to say, yes, we want to do this now. But these are definitely things that could be done in the future. Of course, drainage improvements. This is the big one that always comes up. Replace that pipe, okay? Well, if we replace the pipe, if we make the pipe bigger, we're going to have to store some water somewhere. There are opportunities to do that. There's on Fountain Lane, there's a large hole just to the side of Central Ave that could be converted into storage, would store a good amount of water. That would help if, and what this would do is move flooding from an area where people live to an area where people don't live, or won't impact structures. So when we look at that, but there are some reasons we might want to do some work on that pipe. One is the big sag that's in it, so it doesn't totally drain, and it does inhibit some flow and conveyance through it. And then also it's showing its age. It's starting to separate. There's some maintenance issues that need to be done. Doesn't mean the whole pipe would be replaced. Doesn't mean, we don't know the details yet, but this is definitely an option and something we would look at, and something that our model could feed us back.
Do you have estimates on the costs?
No, not at all.
And, another thought about that is that just thinking a little bit out of the box is maybe we use that storage unit, but with plans to, once it becomes more of a universal replacement of the pipe so that it is consistent, to re-divert it back to that.
That's a good idea.
So that's just, it is a more expensive option over the long term, but it is something to consider.
Yeah, and keep in mind that when we're going through this, it's not that one solution is solving all the problems. It's very cumulative. And, what we're talking about here are some potential solutions, and it could be a combination of any of these combined that could help solve these problems.
And the cost is many millions of dollars for sure. And that's where we have to sharpen our pencils and get ready for the the Environmental Bond Act monies and see what we can get from that. I mean, it's for the whole state, but they did
we
put
do
in a
have-
lot of money for flooding.
Yeah, we do have Laura Tessier, our grant and funding manager, keeping an eye on things for the town and some opportunities. Earmark funding could also be a possibility
Right.
related to stormwater. So we would, I believe I sent that over to the town But we would encourage, and we could have a separate offline conversation about that, we would encourage you to start those discussions with your representatives at the state level to best
And
position.
federal, because there's a lot of infrastructure monies, too.
One thing, sorry, I was just going to say, one thing, just to point out, and Joe, if you could just go back to the prior slide. The image that you see on the bottom left, so that's an atlas map, I believe that's from 1930. And that's a good representation of where the Troublesome Brook is. And you can see it's to the western side of Central Park Avenue. It was originally an entirely open watercourse, and that's why it's shown that way, how it kind of meanders along the road there. Obviously, things have changed since that time, so there's been a lot of major development along Central Park Avenue.
A lot of
And-
parking lots.
Yes, and a lot of impervious areas, and so now it's a mixture of open watercourse as well as portions of the brook that are now piped or enclosed. And so coming up with a solution, that's kind of part one or phase one, but that also requires or may require obtaining proper easements, obtaining permissions from property owners, because a good portion of this watercourse goes through private property, for which we do not have easements for, and, you know, it's not something we can just necessarily go in and install a larger pipe without getting the permissions from those property owners. So that's going to be something else that we'll have to take into consideration once that time comes.
And just so we all understand where we are now, so we have an RFP basically teed up, ready to go.
Request for proposal.
Thank you. For surveying work.
We don't want to have it inside baseball. We need
Okay. The bonding for the capital projects is going to be done soon, and we expect to have funding for this work in mid-October, at which point, if the board approves of the proposals we put forth, we would then go forward with the surveying. Woodard and Curran would get that information, plug it into their model, and then move on from there. So we are on hold until we get the funding, but we are ready to take action on the next step.
So that's county as well as town, or just town?
Right now, it's just town.
Okay.
But we'll take the county help also.
Sorry, Joe.
Yep. All right, other possible solutions and improvements that we could make. These are just a couple examples of storage, and again, typically in urban environments, we're looking for storage at every opportunity. The two pictures on the left here are obviously the pre-Troublesome Brook and then the end of Manhattan Park Brook, all the way down by the Bronx River. So it's already, that area is already designed to hold a large amount of water, convey a lot of water. But these are just as an example of things you could do. I know we've already worked on Troublesome Brook there, but these are examples of things you could do. The center picture, that's my backyard and my detention pond. And under that water is a lot of green grass, except where the weeds are. And I pull that up because it's an example of a place that storage was added, and it adds to the whole system, but typically it's not storage, it's a yard. And so people play on it, we recreate on it, things of that nature. So don't always think of storage as a dedicated pond or something else. And then, of course, to the right is a underground storage system, designed to be put in under parking lots. You close it up, but they can also be used, but they become very expensive compared to just moving a little bit of dirt around. So these are all examples, and when we look at this, again, we'll put these storage areas in our model. We'll literally just change the terrain so it stores water, and we'll be able to evaluate them. But we do expect that if we did any storage, we'd have to spread it out. There's just not one big area to put in. The other thing,
And
which
the storage system, very expensive.
it depends how you make it. If you just move dirt around, it's reasonably priced. I mean, we've done like trenching projects, large, maybe we'll call them large channels for hundreds of thousands of dollars, but obviously if you put it under a parking lot and it's made out of concrete, then it's millions, but.
Would the storage option also be something that we could use, throughout the town? Because we have other areas, we're focusing on 2 areas now, but we have other areas that have been flooding, and I'm wondering if this might be like a cost-effective, option that could help.
Right, and what we would try to do is identify areas we could put storage, then we'd add it to the model and see how it helps.
So that's something that,
Yeah.
when we're meeting with all our constituents all over the town, we could look at.
And these models were done in 2 specific areas. To do something like that, you're looking at doing it for the entire town.
No, that's what I'm saying, right.
You have to start somewhere.
Yep.
Like, for example, like Old Kensington Road, that area, we've had flooding problems there. Is that in the Manhattan, where Randolph and near the county center? Don't we have,
Can you pull up the Manhattan Brook watershed? Yeah, please.
I'm just trying to think of areas where, I've gotten
You're talking
complaints.
about Fulton Park, right?
Yeah, because I'm saying, would the storage possibly be like something that could help that area?
Can you,
This one.
anyway, can you zoom into that? Or is it?
I don't know if this one's better, I didn't
I think the topo.
get any detail. That one's better.
Yeah.
And
Well, we can get
north is,
specifics,
this is north, so.
but it's something certainly we could look into.
Yeah, I think that's good. This is excellent. You're doing a really good job. I'm really enthusiastic about this.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The other thing we have talked about in the past is either elevating or removing structures. It's something you can do almost at any time. Anytime you have a disaster declaration, you can get money through FEMA to do that. There is some paperwork. We actually talked about doing the short form version here, I believe, out on Warren Ave. But that's also an additional opportunity to eliminate homes from flooding. A lot of times it's done after an event, so if a home is damaged, then they're going to have to put work into it anyway, so elevating is just additional work they would do. Or if they decided they didn't want to be flooded anymore and they wanted to sell, the town would initiate it, but a lot of times they can be completely funded through FEMA to actually do the buyouts. And then the land would sit vacant, and then you could do other things with it, like you could provide areas of storage, or you just leave it as green space, but it could never be built on again, so.
Because when you think of, say, Troublesome Brook,
Yeah.
we basically have, how many homes would you say generally always get flooded? Maybe 5, we get complaints about maybe 5, 6 people.
There's a current, right now, anybody along that brook anybody along the brook has been impacted. The last few storms, the last 2 weeks, we've had 3 residents get impacted.
Right.
When you have an Ida, the whole area gets impacted. I think what Joe's saying is if these properties are damaged, there's a program where the properties could be bought and the structures removed and then left. So for instance, you just had 2 homes sell on that road, I think 1 for sure. And since they bought the home, they've been flooded. So, there's a way to mitigate that. We have put the flood maps on the town website, so that there's more ways to inform people of where they're moving into. But,
And I think that's important when it comes to, at least on FEMA's end, with purchasing of the properties, if they're in a designated flood plain, right, or an area that's prone to flooding or considered to be a flood hazard area, then that's what FEMA would take into consideration. In Clarendon Place, in particular, that is, or at least the first portion, the southern portion of Clarendon Place, is currently in a flood hazard area, and it has been for some time. So, obviously, that would be something
And
to
is that,
definitely consider.
you said it's 100% funded with no match?
It is often 100% funded. Usually you have to do the administrative part of it, but the actual purchase of the home can be up to 100%.
As
funded.
opposed to, because in what we're doing, looking at for Babbitt Court, for instance, I think it's a 90-10, isn't it? So, yeah, so that,
But
it varies.
It depends on the, and it
And-
depends on
and
the
is it-
disaster.
Yeah, and maybe it's 100, I don't know, I'm asking.
I-
Is it 100% if they buy out the home, or is it across the boards in, for instance, Babbitt Court would be 90-10?
The standard, and I think if you read it, that there is no 100%. Where the 100% comes from is Congress, when they pass funding for the disaster, and then they cover that.
Right,
And
got it.
And I'll just say it's done often.
Yeah,
So that, so there is often cost share, but a lot of times that's just wiped out by Congress. So it depends on the disaster that happens just before. And I believe it's HMGP, Hazard Mitigation Grant Program is the primary funder for that, and those come out after disasters.
yeah.
So,
But also, it's 100% of what it's considered to have, it's worth, right? And of course, you now have properties that have been repeatedly flooded. They're not worth $1 million. FEMA's not going to pay what you might be able to get at with an arm's length sale. Two things about that is if you're buying a home and you're buying it cash, you don't have a bank involved, you have to be careful what you're buying, right? Because if you have a mortgage, they're going to come out and do an inspection and find out that this home floods. And at least you'll be making an informed decision buying it. And secondly, when we have these situations like with Babbitt Court, we know very well of a situation where 2 years later, we're doing all the paperwork, we're doing everything that we're supposed to be doing. We don't still have any guarantees from FEMA that that's going to be covered, correct? We're still going through the process.
Yeah, still waiting.
And
Right.
you have somebody who can't live in that home, and so the
And
system's,
is
the
paying
system's
taxes.
broken. The system is definitely broken.
And mortgage.
And paying mortgage on that house that's not, can't be inhabited.
And there's
So-
truth in selling too, in terms of
right.
the
And so,
seller.
so the
informing.
whole system is not designed. Our 25-year pipes, nobody here was the one who designed the 25-year pipes. Nobody here likely covered over Troublesome Brook and put, basically enclosed it. But that's what we're living with now, and somehow we have to be able to deal with the water situation that we have as best we can, using every one of these mitigation impacts, decreasing the amount of impervious surface, which constantly is increasing, right? And so, I do want to say just before, because, somebody will get up at a town board meeting, before I mention Con Ed is easy to deal with because you can just increase the gauge of the wire. I'm well aware you have to decrease the gauge of the wire, because as the gauge gets smaller, it can hold more amperage. So just before anybody writes or emails, I'm well aware of how it works.
Okay.
And the last thing that I wanted to mention that we'll definitely look at, and this was something that when the work on Troublesome was done, we actually looked at, and I don't know the current status of this, but we do know that there is a pipe system that comes down Mountjoy Ave, collects the water, and then basically there's another pipe that takes it upstream and then dumps it out into the Troublesome Brook, which is the red line. And one of the things we would look at initially is just why that was done, and we try to restore the direct connection and to eliminate that big loop that's being made. I know that is something we've talked about in the past as a maintenance activity, but we would look, I just give this as an example because everybody, or a lot of people here know about it, but we would look for all those throughout the system and look at areas where it just doesn't seem to make sense. Why are we doing this? And should we do something a little bit different? An example we had in a different community was And it was one of these, we were at a community meeting and someone mentioned this. They said, hey, there's 2 pipes coming into that ditch, but only 1 going out. And so we said, oh, okay, well, we better look at that. We looked at it. It didn't actually change the flood level, but what it did change was how long that area was flooded, and it reduced it by over half by putting in a secondary pipe. And the biggest reason we could do that is because of the timing. We could drain that whole ditch before the big flood was coming through the main system. And so, looking at the system and looking for these places where we can add efficiency to it is another thing we can do with the models that we're putting together. And we'll do.
So there's small fixes too, rather than just the big, and are those potentially some of the small fixes, something that we could do more immediately with more limited funding that will alleviate some of the flooding for the time being, with the plan to do the bigger fixes
Yeah,
as well?
that's a great point. I mean, one community where we're taking that approach is the city of Norwalk, actually. Excuse me, we did a citywide study for Norwalk, and we are prioritizing, but initially based on available funding, we are focusing on some smaller projects, let's say, as opposed to the real large scale, and we're in the middle of design on some of those right now, actually. So it's a smart approach and alternative, provided that it makes sense, for the community.
Could that loop that doesn't seem to make sense, could that have been put in with the intention of it buys you some time? It's also basically it's not a detention, but at least for a 25-year storm, you're not putting so much water so quickly into the Troublesome Brook.
Yeah, and the great thing about the model we'll put together, it'll tell us. We'll compare the two. We'll look at the depths. We'll look at the flows. We'll look at the extent of the floodplain in that area and see how it changes.
Of course, that all fails once you go over a 25-year storm, because now there's continuous flow. It's detaining nothing. It's interesting. It'll be interesting to see how the study handles that.
Yeah.
So again, the next step will be an RFP, request for proposal, for surveying work. It's going to be a costly survey that will be in front of this board, hopefully in November, and then we'll move from there.
$300, $400, what?
And where are you going to be advertising the request for proposal, Rich?
When we know we're going to have, when we're
Say
reasonably
where.
certain we're going to have the funding.
Where?
Oh, we put it on BidNet, it goes out on the town website, we put it everywhere we can.
Okay.
So in
This
This
terms of,
contract reporter that you, like we've mentioned, you should look into that, please. Thank you.
one of the
Go ahead,
suggestions
Brian.
was made, we have this co-op, we were looking at a possible, agreement where they would give us an easement to their property. It's off Underhill Road.
Supervisor, with all due respect, I think we shouldn't discuss that issue tonight and
Okay,
address it at a later time.
okay. Yeah, I'm just wondering is there like anything that would be not that expensive, that would be affordable, that we could do, say, in the next year? That,
Once we get that survey work and they put that into their model, they'll be able to tell us that.
So for both Manhattan Brook and Troublesome Brook, there's a possibility that we could be taking additional action, say, within the next 12 months?
We've taken actions already. In
Right.
fact, one of the pictures that we had up there of the Manhattan Brook under the Route 119 was completely cleaned out.
Manhattan Brook, I haven't
Yeah,
gotten
119.
any complaints recently.
There's been some real interesting developments over the last year. In fact, we had our Sawmill River meeting today, and, after talking to Brian, the last few storm events we haven't seen any impact on Babbitt. And they just did a massive dam removal project at Layton's in Ardsley. And I brought that up today. They're going to look at maybe possible repercussions of that work. So that might have helped upstream from us.
Positive repercussions.
Positive, very positive. And there's still a few more things we can be doing there. But Manhattan Brook, we cleaned out under Route 119. We found carriages from Pergamon. That's how long.
Wow.
Yes. That's how long the blockage was there. And at the center, the Theodore Young Community Center, you're able to see the level during these storms. And Anthony Graves, who's been with us many years, has been out there and taken looks, and he said he's never seen it that low.
Here you're seeing one channel totally blocked.
Yeah, and that's been completely cleaned up, and inside that channel's been cleaned up. And our code enforcement officer issued notices for them to clean out past there, and that's been done. So all this is having, a
No,
positive effect.
I understand.
Now, who's responsible for that cleanup?
On the private side, it was the property owner, and under there, we took care of it.
But who's responsible for it?
New York State DOT.
Exactly, right. So what we're having is, but I know we pass over it, and sometimes we smile, but because we are the people that our residents see and interact with, do something about it. We need our state agencies to step up on state property, our county people to step up on county property. But many times what happens is it's town going in, and sometimes when we don't have jurisdiction to do it, but it's not going to get done unless we do. But that's a cost on the town taxpayers in order for us to do this. And this is a perfect example of how the town had to go in and fix that, because the backup, when somebody gets flooded, they don't care if it's state, county, or town, but we're here in the neighborhood, and people come and say, do something about it. If we can't get those that are supposed to be fixing it, we basically go in and do it. And that's the same thing as with the Sawmill River. It's supposed to be the Army Corps of Engineers, and one time we actually went in and did work, and then they came after us because they accused us of damaging a bridge, a small bridge or something like that.
It was a pathway.
Right.
We routinely team up with the Village of Elmsford and put, boots in the river and pull out anything we can. And again, there were pictures we demonstrated this morning that there's been some really intense cleanups there.
That's great what, you're doing. But you've been doing it for a number of years, but.
I think what Councilman Sheehan is saying is there are others. In fact, in this respect to this culvert system, the state didn't even have it in their register. So I think they're still trying to determine one that was put in, so.
But I think, when people watch this meeting, on the internet or on TV, at least they'll see that we're trying, and that there's no simple answers, and everything you do could have different consequences. And I think so I think this is going to be very useful information for people to have, and will make it much easier for people to appreciate the difficulty of solving some of these problems.
Yeah, what I'll also say is with the 2D model, and we've seen it in some of the other communities, Norwalk comes to mind, that when we do get results and we're doing the presentations to present on our findings, it's very helpful for them to visualize and see with things like Joe ran earlier, that model, and visualizing where the water goes, and it's very helpful in terms of interaction with the community.
Great.
I'm hoping the takeaway from people listening to this is, they're doing another study, right? We're doing a lot more than that. Matter of fact, this has been an ongoing project for quite a long time, and from even the initiation of that study, actual work has been done. We just explained how we're going in where we're really not supposed to go in and do cleaning out of the waterways so that our residents aren't getting flooded. So there is a lot of work that's going on, but we also have to be mindful that you can turn climate change into politics or not, but that water, if it's coming into your basement, it's coming into your basement, and we need to be able to deal with the flooding situation that is just going to get worse and worse. And so what we're trying to do is almost do the impossible and turn 100-year storms and 300-year storms into the equivalent of a 25-year storm, and it's just not going to happen. So we're doing everything we possibly can, and we're going to continue. So if you're here, we're going to be continuing this study by doing a survey. It's not that we're going to be waiting for that survey to come out before we do anything, because we're continuing to do work on this project, on
Great.
this topic. We have a hard stop in 3 minutes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, you did a great job.
Thank you for having us,
Is
appreciate
there
it.
anything that you left out?
No, we're good.
Okay. That was your last
Okay.
slide?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you both, Rich and Brian.